can I get a big applause for Miss Bernadine Brady?
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Gus, for revealing my murky past. So I'm delighted to be here. Thank you so much to Sylvia and all the team for inviting me, and I'm really enjoying the summit so far. So it's lovely to have a chance to do a presentation. So today I'm going to do a talk about voice and participation in youth mentoring. So actually some of the questions this morning after Sam's talk referred a little bit to some of these issues. So hopefully they will be of interest to some people. My title, Hearing the Voice Through the Cracks, I'll explain. That will become apparent what I mean by that as I go along through the presentation. So just to say, when I was chatting to Sylvia about what I might talk about, she actually prompted me to consider talking about this topic, because I've done a lot of research with my colleagues in Galway and Ireland on youth participation, children's participation in decision making. So we've done a whole body of research with TUSLA, which is our national social service organisation, around embedding children's voice and participation in their programme of work at a national level. And myself and my colleagues had done an evaluation of that over a number of years. But I'd also done research on youth mentoring, but I always kept the two things separate, and I hadn't really thought about how they related to each other. So it was, I've Sylvia to thank for prompting me to start to consider the concepts of voice and participation in youth mentoring. So please bear with me today while I share some of my reflections and thoughts. So I suppose a lot of what I'm going to say is my own reflections and initial ideas. It's not coming from any systematic study that I've done of this question, but who knows, it might lead to some specific type of research in the future. So what I'm going to do in the presentation, firstly, I'm going to introduce the concepts of youth voice and participation and just unpack them a little bit in terms of what they mean. Some of you will be familiar with them, some of you less so. And then I'm going to reflect on two questions. So what role does youth mentoring play in facilitating youth voice? And secondly, then, at an organisational level in youth mentoring organisations, what opportunities exist to further enhance youth voice and participation? So when we talk about youth voice, I'm kind of using the terms voice and participation interchangeably. They're probably slightly different, but they kind of get at the same thing. So when we talk about youth voice, broadly, it means opportunities for young people to speak, to be heard, and to be listened to. And that can be in any dimension or setting. And participation, child or youth participation has been defined as the process by which children and young people have active involvement and real influence on decision making on matters affecting their lives. So that comes from the Irish National Strategy on Youth Participation. So in Ireland at a national level, we have a national strategy that guides organisations, services, policies working with young people around their obligation to include children in decision making on matters affecting their lives. So I suppose, why youth voice? Why is it necessary to talk about this? And I know a lot of you, even looking at the experience since I've come to the Netherlands, I see young people and students everywhere. They're involved in running the hotel, they're, running the restaurant. It's just a wonderful example of youth participation and action. But I suppose in society at large, that's not always the case. We kind of have a tendency to construct young people as vulnerable, as incompetent, to have kind of deficit stereotypes about young people, that they're in need of intervention and improvement. They, in their daily lives, they're subject to a high degree of structure and control, from going to school, they're very rigid timetable, they're told what to wear, they're told how they can or can't wear their hair or their makeup or whatever way they might want to express themselves. Even within the family, they can be subject to a lot of control. So I suppose the net result is that there can be a tendency to deny young people the capacity of agency, and to deny them their own subjecthood in their own lives in terms of having control over their own lives or a say over what happens in their own lives. So the construct of voice comes from a broader set of social and political theory, say like the work of Axel Honneth and Nancy Fraser, which is about the struggle for recognition and inclusion for excluded groups in society. So when we talk about youth voice, we touch on issues of power and control and who has control in society. And it's about the group that is lacking in voice, if you like, wanting to be recognized for who they are, wanting to be, acknowledged as valuable human beings and to be included in society. So when we talk about youth participation and voice, we're talking about strengthening youth resources, as Lynn Nibel describes it, to debate, to inquire, to contest, and to oppose the views of the powerful, and to tip the balance of power more back in the favor of young people. So it's really interesting as well, delving into some of the social theory on this. We can often think of youth voice and participation as a very instrumental thing. Did we ask young people their opinions? Tick, yes, we did. But actually, it's really interesting to just reflect on it a little bit more deeply. So Spiro reminds us that different institutional settings enable particular types of voices to be heard, and they suppress others. So, for example, he argues that in school settings, children are kind of encouraged to give the right answer, or the answer that's kind of socially acceptable within that setting. Whereas with their peers, they might give a totally different answer. And I think we're all guilty of that. What we say at work is very different to what we say at home when we are giving out about people at work. So, the nature of settings shapes the type of voice that's permitted in that space. So young people are so intuitively aware of this, They know intuitively when they're free to speak openly and honestly and when they're not. And they learn to kind of fit and shape and mold themselves into what adults expect from them. So I suppose it challenges us as practitioners, as policymakers, as researchers, to try to hear both the spoken and the unsayable, and to create new contexts where young people might speak through the cracks. So I suppose we have to move beyond the obvious in terms of, to try and listen for maybe what young people aren't saying, to listen what they are saying, to create new spaces where they feel free to speak. And what the term through the cracks, particularly for young people maybe who aren't heard or who've had difficult lives, it's really important in particular that we create spaces for them to speak. So the roots of voice and participation, I suppose a lot of the work came from the sociology of childhood, which challenged the kind of deficit views of young people and drew attention to the capacity of children and youth for agency. And then this was really solidified in legal terms by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. So it has been ratified by 195 countries. Just the USA and Somalia are the only countries that haven't ratified it. So the overall aim of the UNCRC is to change the way children are viewed. So it really upholds their rights to be treated as human beings with a distinct set of rights, rather than passive objects of care and charity. So Article 12 of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, a lot of you will be very familiar with. So it basically states children and young people's rights to be informed about matters that affect them. It upholds their right to express their views and their right to have their views taken into account. It was considered one of the most radical articles of the convention because I suppose it really explicitly shifts the balance of power from adults towards young people. But I suppose one of the concerns that people had was that it was taking away the power and control of parents. And it's really not about that. It's about, obviously, parents and adults still have a really important role to play, but it's that young people's views and perspectives need to be taken seriously and taken into account. It's not necessarily that they'll get their own way, but that their views will be taken seriously. So decisions or input into what? So I suppose that the reach of the UNCRC is it's very far-reaching. It has implications for everything to do with young people's lives, personal issues and decisions, and also public issues or circumstances that affect children as a whole. So this could be youth-specific issues to do with schooling or, leisure, or it can also be broader societal issues that affect children and young people as well as adults, for example, the environment or transport or so on. So there's actually a huge range of things that young people's views need to be seriously considered in relation to. There's a large body of research that shows that when young people are engaged in decision making, that it brings a whole range of benefits. So for example, in terms of personal development, young people can develop communication skills, they, decision making, they have improved self-efficacy, improved self-confidence, self-esteem, and importantly, they report a much greater sense of well-being as a result of. There's a quote from one of the authors, Polke, who says that, when you deny people agency, that you're at risk of them being outsiders in their own lives. So none of us want to be outsiders in our own lives. So we get a better sense of well-being when we're actually participants in our own lives. From a social justice point of view, participation is really important in terms of that collective consciousness that can emerge from people coming together to discuss issues, to challenge negative stereotypes, to build positive identities, and so on. There's also been a lot of research evidence in relation to improved service provision. So by drawing on this experiential knowledge that people have in terms of using services, we can ensure the services are relevant, that they're appropriate, and that they're effective. And people working in organisations that have a strong culture of participation as well report that they have a much stronger sense of programme purpose because they know that what they're doing is rooted in actual needs, desires, wishes, dreams, aspirations of the people that they're working with. Some of their, I've avoided having a slide on criticisms or negatives because I think we'll be touching on some of those, but just to frame it more positively in terms of what we need to do in practice, some of the critical factors are really ensuring that power sharing with young people is genuine and not tokenistic, that it's not that tick the box exercise, that it's actually coming from a place of viewing children as equals, appreciating and upholding their rights, having a commitment to hear their authentic voices. Another thing that's really important is relationships. So a lot of participation work depends on good quality relationships between adults and young people. So that's really important. And allied to that then, the attitudes and skills of adults is really important in terms of their attitudes towards young people, and it can be really important for adults to be trained in this regard in terms of challenging negative stereotypes or deficit views they may have of young people, and also developing the skills to engage with young people to really, really hear their voices and so on. So there have been a lot of conceptual models developed around voice and participation. So this is a popular one that's used to guide policy in Ireland. It was developed by Laura Lundy in Queen's University in Belfast. And basically, Lundy developed this because she found that when people talked about Article 12, they tend to talk a lot about the first part of it, which is young people's right to express their views. So there was a lot of emphasis on hearing children's voices, but there was actually less emphasis placed on the second part of Article 12, which is children and young people's rights to have their views given due weight. So she developed this four-strand model. So the first part of it is space, that young people need to be given space to express their views, to have a safe place where they can talk. They need to be facilitated to express their voices, to speak in an authentic way. And then also they need an audience. They need adults to listen to what they're saying, and they also need influence. So they need for their views to be given due weight, to be taken seriously in decisions that are made. As I said earlier, it's not necessarily that they get their own way, but that they that their views are taken seriously and feedback is given to them on the decisions made and how their views were informed what was decided. So this can apply to a whole range of settings. It could apply to organizational settings, but it can also apply to individual relationships. Another model, a lot of you will be familiar with various models like Sherry Arnstein's ladder of participation, and Harry Shearer has one as well, and there are other ladders. This one is from NAPPI, nappi.co.uk, I think it is, which is really just a way of illustrating the different way organizations can engage with young people in terms of sharing power. So at the bottom of the ladder, you have approaches like coercion, education, where the process is one way, where adults do something to the young person. There's no feedback from the young person. It's purely one-way traffic. The next couple of rungs up are doing for. So this is like things like informing, consultation, engagement, where there is two-way traffic, but there is an engagement of the young person, but there's no commitment to sharing power. The adults can still take the information they've got, say, from a consultation and do what they want. They're not necessarily obliged to do anything with it. So in this case, in the doing for, the adults still hold on to the power, and the young people are still relatively powerless. So at the top of the ladder are models like co-production and co-design, which involve sharing power with young people, between adults and young people. So this is where adults and young people work together, for example, on service design or something of that nature. So the term co-production, it was developed by a woman called Eleanor Alstrom back in the 70s in the States. And she noticed that crime rates were reduced in the States, where police, rather than driving around in their cars, where they actually walked the streets. So because they were walking the streets, they were talking to people, they were finding out information, they were building relationships, and actually it resulted in crimes being prevented and crime rates being reduced. So she noted that actually the reduced crime rates was co-produced between the police and the communities they were working with. So that's just a nice example just to illustrate what co-production is, that it's sometimes what makes intuitive sense in terms of engaging with somebody to do something better. So it doesn't have to be a whole elaborate big structure of co-production. It can actually be a more kind of informal way of working together to figure something out. So I'm going to come back to this in a few minutes when I'm applying this to mentoring. So yeah, so that's participation, voice, just to unpack. I've unpacked that concept a little bit. So I want to move on now just to explore what role youth mentoring plays in facilitating youth voice. So as I say, these are purely my own reflections. I've been doing research on mentoring for 15 to 20 years since I gave up picking mushrooms. And I have, so these are just some random reflections based on some research that I did a couple of years ago. So I did one-to-one interviews with young people. I was on sabbatical for a year, so I had this luxury of time where I could do and what I wanted to do was just forget about all the kind of outcomes, frameworks and everything. I just wanted to talk to young people in their own words about their own experiences of what it was like to take part in mentoring. So young people, they had been involved in the Big Brothers Big Sisters program, which matches, a lot of you will be familiar with. It's kind of like a friendship model where the mentor and the young person meets over a year, minimum of a year, and they meet every week and so on. So these young people were all young people in foster care or residential care. And I was just curious to know how mentoring had impacted on their lives. So some of you may have heard me talking about it before. So I'm not going to go into the findings, but I'm just going to reflect back on some of the young people's narratives in terms of what they said, in terms of the concepts of voice in that. So, I suppose in this study and in most of your work, young people have complex lives. There's no you can portray things in a very simple way, but I suppose when you talk to young people, you realize actually there's layers and layers of complexity there that they're dealing with. A lot of experienced poverty, socioeconomic disadvantage, family breakup, new families, further breakdowns, addiction, disability, different issues, as well as experiences of racism and other forms of discrimination. A lot of them have lots of professionals in their lives, be it teachers, social workers, psychologists, so on. So that's the context. So I suppose going back to my point earlier then about how particular institutional spaces shape the nature of voice in that setting, it really occurs to me that the institutional setting of youth mentoring relationships really, surprise, surprise, shapes the nature of youth voice in that setting. So when we think about the setting of youth mentoring relationships, they're voluntary, so you don't have to do it. They're relational, they're very completely relationship based. They allow a luxury of time and space relative to other things. So there's time for that relationship to develop. There's space, there's no particular agenda for the meetings, they're open. It's removed from normal life, so it's not about school, it's not about, obviously you can have mentoring in school, but it's taking you out of your family, your microsystem. It's fun, activity based. Again, this is a critical factor in terms of, some people would have talked about having done counselling and been forced to sit down and talk, which they don't like, whereas actually doing things can produce a particular type of voice as well. So I suppose I would argue that these kind of factors really create a context for youth voice in youth mentoring. So looking across the youth narratives that I collected, I could really see reference in what some of the young people said to a perception that their voices had been suppressed or hadn't been heard in other settings. So for example, in their families, in the school, among social work services. They also, I'm going to go through each of these now in a little bit more detail, but I just want to flag them first. They showed an awareness of their role as a stakeholder in these settings and the implications of speaking truthfully. So in other words, they knew what they said had implications, so therefore they kept quiet, or they molded what they said to keep the peace in certain situations. They really valued mentoring as a space where their voice could be heard without complication. And also what I found was that the relationship really nurtures their confidence in and willingness to use their own voice. So at the start, a lot would have been quite shy, quite, in on themselves, whereas they would have described how they gradually became more confident as time went on, which is really important. It's really obvious, but it's actually really important in terms of voice that you have that basic level of confidence. So this is an example from Rachel. So Rachel was 21 when I interviewed her, and she had been involved with the mentoring program since she was 12, and she was actually it was one of these amazing matches that she's still in touch with her mentor. So Rachel came from a traveller background, which is an ethnic minority group in Ireland and a very marginalised group, and she had missed a lot of primary school because of various family moves and so on. When she started secondary school, she was just completely at sea. She fell behind. She reached the point, she said, at 15 where she wanted to drop out of school. And she had been matched with a mentor, and then she was matched with another mentor around this time. So this is a quote from Rachel, and I've just highlighted in yellow how her voice was suppressed. So she said she never really went to secondary school. I was really behind, but it was expected. Well, why can't you do this? And why do we have to get you grinds in this? Why can't you just do it yourself? And then I stopped asking for help. So you can see there, that's where she just learned to just stop using her voice, and her perception of how other people spoke to her was that it was all their views telling her what to do all the time. So Rachel ended up having a really good connection with her mentor, who was also a youth worker, which was fantastic. They really worked through a lot of her issues. They reflected on, what had happened to her, all her experiences, and her mentor facilitated her basically to do a pros and cons list of why she could stay in school or why she should leave. So she ended up realizing herself that the pros outweighed the cons, even though loads of people had told her this. This was the first time she was actually listening, because it was actually her own voice. And she went back to school, and the mentor supported her to get a lot of support and help, and even gave her grinds in particular subjects. So this is the way Rachel described, I suppose, she interweaves what's different about mentoring with how other people had engaged with her. So she said they have a way, and it's interesting, she refers to they as the program as opposed to just the mentor, which I'm going to refer to that later on. They have a way, they don't give out to you for doing things, they try and listen, which as a child, everyone just shouts their perspective at you, but they actually sit you down, they just listen to you and your perspective, and they don't discourage you just because you're a child or just because you don't know what you're on about. So again, she had really internalized these deficit views of children, and she really felt that as a child, she was so frustrated, and like I said earlier, she had just stopped talking at that point. And as a matter of interest, she went on to college, and at the time I met her, she was waiting to, or she was about to start a master's degree, and she herself now is a mentor as well. So there was another example of Lily, who was 14, and Lily's was in foster care with her aunt, and her aunt had three young daughters, so the house was crazy busy. Lily's mother was in drugs treatment. She had a complicated relationship with her father. So she would have talked again about that. She had such a busy, cluttered life and she was a stakeholder in all these different settings. So she felt, I suppose, for her, the match was somewhere that she could really, like she described it, I talked to someone out of not the real world, but outside of that kind of world, that kind of space. So again, that space of being outside was really important in terms of Lily's voice being heard. And, it's like her own thing, that space that I have to myself. Similarly, Robin, who was 15, described, she said, when you're in care, you're kind of sticking to yourself because a lot has gone on in your life before you went into care. And then it's easier to talk to someone you didn't know, who doesn't know anything about it. So again, that point of who doesn't know anything about it, who isn't a stakeholder, who doesn't have an opinion or a stake, that it's somebody you can talk to outside of that who will just accept you for who you are and listen to you, was really important for her in terms of her voice being heard. And the point about confidence, this was Sophie. She said,
sorry to interrupt, we have 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes, yeah, great, thanks. So Sophie talked about, again, the confidence, just talking to people really helped her to have her voice heard. So far what I've talked about has been mostly the space voice dimensions of the, so you might ask of Article 12, what about the audience and influence? What happened in these relationships? Did they achieve the second part of audience and influence, which is really important in terms of, so I suppose I could see as well from the narratives that the mentors and caseworkers formed an alliance with young people to, I suppose in keeping with kind of empowerment or critical approaches to mentoring, by chatting with the young person, talking about their issues, they helped them to develop a critical consciousness, to realize that actually a lot of the issues they were facing weren't their own fault. They might have experienced them as being their own fault, but actually they were due to structural issues, things that were outside of their control, and help them to see that and to understand that. And then they also worked with them to connect to opportunities, to social capital, to advocate for the young person in terms of getting what they needed. But the critical point is that they weren't doing this based on what they thought the young person needed. The mandate came from the youth voice itself. So you could argue there that the influence that was produced in the relationship was co-produced by the organisation and the young person. So I suppose what mentoring style facilitates youth voice? I would argue very strongly a listening, non-judgmental, non-directive approach, presence approach, which myself and Pat Dolan have written about based on the work of Andreas Barrett, which is about listening, respecting the dignity of the person, not explicitly focused on problem solving, but problem solving emerges as part of the presence approach. Power with rather than over the mentee. And there's a lovely quote from Freire that Oscar Prieto Flores and his colleagues had in a chapter where he said that the mentor shouldn't take control of the life, dreams and aspirations of the mentee. So I think that that's really important, that their life, dreams and aspirations are their own and that the mentor just facilitates them to be heard. I have to finish up, so I'll really quickly, just in terms of mentoring organizations, some of the things I think are really important are to reflect on this ladder where you sit on it, to reflect on your organizational narrative. Are you more about doing to young people or are you about doing with young people? And there's a book by Tori Weston Sheridan where she talks about this critical approach to mentoring, where she kind of sets out a lot of these kinds of things. I would argue as well that there's a real value in collective participation structures, which is groups of young people brought together, which can really complement the one-to-one relationship, strengthen the evolving capacity of the young person, develop peer friendship and support, and then also feed into service improvement and design and so on. And then there are some other ways, so embedding commitment to youth voice in a strategic plan, having a clear conceptual model to guide practice, having clear guidelines for workers in terms of making sure that people's voices are heard, having a feedback and complaints mechanism, ideally an anonymous one, again, just recognizing that voice, particular mechanisms, maybe people don't want to voice criticisms.
Really
I'm going to finish. Okay,
sorry.
That's it. Sorry for going over.
It's so rude because you're talking about truth. It feels so wrong to interrupt someone who's talking so passionate about being undivided attention and involving people, voices being heard, and then we step in. Sorry, thank you, time's up.
My
thank
voice
you very
being suppressed.
much.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bernadine. And especially I think you shared youth voices, which is extremely important because it's what we are mostly in contact of, but also we are working with adults, and I think we can translate this message on also to the target groups we are all working with. So thank you very much. It's very important. We have maybe one question?
Or maybe we can save the questions for the open space, and if there are any questions, they can direct them directly to...
sure.
Good
idea.
Yeah,
okay,
great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Can I get another big applause?